Well, I am Joe Armstrong. I moved to the township right after World War II. I honestly don't know. It was either late 1945 or early 1946, and moved to Copes Bridge at that point. Before that, I lived in Westchester and Biddle Street during the war. And before we get to East Bradford, I got to talk about a war experience, because it was unique. I lived on Biddle Street in Westchester. Bill Wood, who now lives over by Sconnelltown, was my best friend. And being kids, and the war was on, you know, we were soldiers. And one time he was over at my house playing, and we looked up and there was an airplane. And of course, he said, "That's a Nazi bomber." So I went, it burst into flames and crashed. It killed about 8 or 10 people. But you could imagine as, I don't know, 4-year-old kid, you know, what have I done? You know, I went down full of tears, you know, apologizing to my mother. I didn't want to hurt anybody. And, I mean, yes, it was a tragedy, but you know, it was one of those things I'm not going to easily forget. Beyond that, I remember the war. You know, I'd go with my mother to the market, and we had ration cards and all that stuff. Things were, you know, the whole country was at war. During the war, they were all the little corner grocery stores, of which they were all over the place in Westchester. And we lived on Biddle Street, and sort of a block to the west was Junta's. And they've gone on to many other grocery stores since, and frankly, sorely missed from the bigger one they had, but that's life. But I am told that at one point, and again, it was when they had the little corner grocery store on Biddle Street, that they got a, what would I call it? One of these bundles of bananas, you know, that's sort of this big around and that long with all the things on it. And they were peeling it off, and a tarantula jumped out. So they called the cops, and the cop was in there, bang, bang, bang. That doesn't strike me as a way to take care of a tarantula, but I understand this actually happened. But during the war, because I mean, people didn't have cars anyway, and no gas and whatever, that basically the corner grocery store was the place a lot of people went. But I think I can remember going with my mother, I guess it was an A&P or whatever, and there was always a ration card, and there were these little stickers and all that stuff about you get so much this and so much that. Friday evening in Westchester was really different than now. I mean, there would be farmers in bib overalls, there would be Mennonites passing out religious information on the corners. I mean, it was a very different place. It was, in retrospect, it was charming, but of course at the time, you know, this is what it is. And Westchester was not shishi at all. I mean, it was, you know, it was pretty much a working place. You know, there's this thin veneer of gentility now that I kind of giggle at. This is Westchester, you know, this is nothing exciting, but I guess people that haven't been here this long think, oh, this is Westchester. And I thought, oh, come on.
Would you like to describe any buildings, maybe 4 buildings?
Oh, boy.
Like the Mansion House, Turk's Head Inn?
Yeah, the Mansion House was, what would that be? That would be Church Street and Gay Street. And that was, I guess, 5 stories high. Market and Church. It was 5 stories high. I mean, it was the hotel in town, and you know, they had a good restaurant. I ate there quite a number of times as a young person.
Did you bring anything into that restaurant?
Oh yes. Well, my mother was quite a character. She, because we lived on the Brandywine in the spring, there'd be various critters that would come out of the Brandywine and come visit. Well, more than once, this was a snapping turtle. And snapping turtles are not really very friendly. But somehow or other, she would corral one of these things and put it into, I don't know, a pail or whatever. I mean, it had to be a pretty big pail, because these were big. And take it in and sell it to the Mansion House to make turtle soup. And I don't know that they may have given her $1 or something just to get rid of her. But I mean, here was this big, nasty looking critter. And she did that more than once. Right after the war, we moved out to Copes Bridge. And the place was farmed at that point by, we called him Pappy Hoops. I'm not sure really what his name was, but he lived 2 farms up the hill. And he didn't have a tractor, he had a team of horses. His son, Bob Hoops, lived actually right down on 52 and was a great stonemason. But Bob Hoops, I mean, I was just a little kid. I'd go in the barn, help them milk cows. They probably had 25 cows. I remember when it was time to bring in the corn, they'd go out in the field with a corn knife and cut it all off and make these piles of it and stacked up in sort of a little teepee. And as a kid, that was a really cool place to run and hide, to sneak into that. Needless to say, it was a very different area at that point. Everything was a farm. There was very, very little traffic.
Would you like to mention about what you did in the spring behind the team of horses?
Oh, I'd go looking for arrowheads, and I'd find them. I mean, I didn't get weighed down with bushels of them, but I found enough to make it worthwhile. In those days, we had a black dog. The black dog slept in the road at night.
Which road was that?
That was Strasburg Road at Cope's Bridge. And, now that dog wouldn't last 30 seconds. But it was different then. I mean, the dog eventually got hit after a couple years. But it was a very different place, very, very much more subdued. Not so many paved roads. Lucky Hill Road that we live on was certainly not paved at that point.
How did it get paved? Who was the supervisor at the time?
Actually, I think my father was, but I was.
What was his name?
Richard Armstrong, and he was quite a character in a lot of ways. He was an engineer, and he had worked through the war for a company over in Downingtown making equipment, a lot of which was used for the Manhattan Project, which was the atom bomb. And he kept being confused because to design this equipment, you had to have physical properties, and the physical properties were wild. And he said, "Are you sure these numbers are right?" "Yeah, the numbers are right." And it wasn't until afterwards he figured out, okay, that's what it was, because they're just such bizarre stuff. But a couple of years after the war, he decided he wanted to go into business for himself and went down and chased the cows out of the barn and started making stuff in the barn. And
What sort of stuff?
well, they're capital equipment for chemical plants and for industrial refrigeration. And it grew and grew and grew. And many years later, after college and grad school and whatever, I went back and joined the company. And by then we had a subsidiary in Holland, and since then one in Scotland and one in Singapore. A lot of industrial travel. But the early days were, it was a great place to grow up as a kid. I mean, there was the Brandywine, there was Little Creek going through the back lawn. Always go and make little dams in the creek and get covered with mud. I started fishing, which I've done a little bit of since then, because it was there. And in those days, there wasn't, all the ball sports and all that organized stuff. It didn't. You're here, amuse yourself. And frankly, there was all this really cool stuff to do. And I look at the kids today and say, boy, you're missing so much.
And
because
when you were in high school, what sort of things did you do outdoors at Cope's Bridge?
Well, I was in the country. When I was probably, 10 or 12 years old, I got a .22 and I'd walk around shooting stuff. If I'd see a hawk, I'd shoot it. Now I cringe at the thought, but it was a chicken hawk. You shot them. And, now, oh my Lord, you got to protect them. But that was then.
Did you run a trap line at all?
Yeah, I trapped.
Who were you trapping? What other people
Well,
in the township were you trapping with?
Well, to be honest, I can't think I was trapping with anybody else in the township, but mostly muskrats and some raccoons and occasionally a possum, which was a mistake, and a skunk was a bigger mistake, and a weasel was pretty neat. We never really had mink there. It turns out mink are back now, but nobody's trapping anymore. But I think I learned more in those years trapping than anything I've ever done outdoors, because you had to be there every day and you just see stuff. And in those days, if you saw a footprint of a deer, that was a really big deal. Not seeing a deer, no, you wouldn't see the deer, but if you saw a footprint, wow. No geese, more ducks, pheasants, quail, they're gone. Now we have turkeys sneaking in, which I think is pretty cool. That's great. And we do seem to have some deer If I look at the front lawn here, I think they like it here.
Well, we might have to think now about where you went to school. Did you go to school in East Bradford?
Well, no, I never did. When we moved out here, I went to school in Westchester at what was the so-called auditorium school, which was tacked onto the back of the auditorium on Church Street. And I went there for 4 years, then I went in almost to Philadelphia to Episcopal Academy.
Can you tell us anything about how it felt to get through Westchester in order to go all the way down to the main line to school?
Well, you do it. Actually, the interesting thing is the roads are drastically better now, but it takes the same amount of time because there's so much more traffic. And it's not much different.
Use the trolley?
Use the trolley. There was I guess in the mornings, there was kind of a cooperative thing of a carpool of different kids going to, well, girls could have been going to Agnes Irwin or Shipley or Baldwin, boys going to Haverford or Episcopal, and parents would pick us up and take us over to Paoli and would catch literally the 819, otherwise known as the Spitball Express, although it wasn't an express. And, just different kids would get off at different places. Coming back, there was one of the faculty members who lived over in Westtown, and he would drive an Episcopal van back and let us off. I guess you'd have to say that's Westtown or Milltown, which is on Route 3, sort of the bottom part of big hills in each direction, and you catch the trolley into Westchester, which was uneventful. I mean, the trolley went, we got on it.
Did you have any other friends that you used to pal around with that lived in East Bradford?
Yeah, I did. There was a guy that lived over in, I think it's called Hidden Valley Farm. I believe now it's Mrs. Lindy, I think that's her name, which is off of 322. And we built rafts on the Brandywine and, messed around doing that kind of stuff. Actually, the island, which is now state or county, I'll get it right, township land behind the waterworks was where we'd go fool around down there in the Brandywine. And, I say we built rafts and it'd fall apart and we'd build another one and fall apart. And, I'm not sure the water quality is exactly what it is right now, but, I was young and dumb, so I didn't worry about that. Like I say, it was a great place to grow up. I mean, there was just all this stuff to do out there. I was never bored. When we moved to Cope's Bridge, there was a fair amount more of the foundry in evidence than there is now. There were various, well, there still is a mill race, although it's partially filled in. There was a spillway that was concrete. At least one of the buildings was there up to kind of halfway up the first floor window level. And there were also little bits and pieces, which I guess still are there, of slag and other stuff that foundries would be dumping.
But can you tell us about the house that you lived in? Who would have lived in that house when it was the Cope Machine Works?
I guess the Copes, I mean, I don't know the Cope genealogy enough to tell you, but I mean, they lived there, and that was the iron founder's house, if you will.
What sort of windows, special windows to pay their workers?
Well, they had a toll, what do they call it? No,
Till.
a box, yeah, a till under the window that they could pull out and pay a guy through the window. They had a couple of those. But I think it was not just iron founders had those. A bunch of the older buildings had those. And I think the house as built was probably, I don't know, 1810 or something like that. I would guess it's of that vintage. I don't think it was earlier than that. I think the back part of it probably was. But I mean, that would have been a very humble building. I know there had been on the back a Dutch oven, which for whatever reason my folks tore out, and there was an 1857 penny in it. So, they tore it out. Whatever, they tore it out. But basically the ruin of the Cope foundry, my folks leveled and basically buried, and same with that concrete spillway. I mean, I could take you out there now and show you a couple little different things if you could see the edge of where the mill race was. And there's the remnant of the dam on the backside over by the waterworks. There's the remnant of the dam there that diverted the water into the spillway.
When you moved back to East Bradford, where did you move to?
Well, I moved to what was then known as the McAllister Farm, where we still are. We moved there in 1967. We rented half of it from Chick Laird, who never gets the accolades he deserves for all the good things he's done for this area. And 2 years later, we bought it, and we had to go and do some pretty heavy restoration in the other half before we could make it civilized, which we did. And we, in the biggest financial transaction in the history of the world, we bought a house, a barn, and 6.351 acres. And shortly thereafter, we heard about conservation easements and thought, hey, that's an interesting idea. What's that all about? And after thinking about it for a while, this is the perfect marriage of altruism and greed. You're doing something good, but you can benefit from it. So we put an easement on the couple acres in front of the house. That was a charitable deduction. That became our down payment for the next piece, and 8 transactions later, the home farms 130 acres. And we're glad it's eased, because it isn't going to change much or at all. And I think we owe it to the community that it remained like this. You know, there's stewardship in owning land. The place has been good to us. We raised 2 daughters here. And now one daughter lives locally, one lives down in Charleston. She brings her kids and they can run around, scream, rant, and rave, and that's good fun. That's good stuff. You know, the place has been good to me. It's changed a whole lot. It's obviously a lot less rural now than it was. You know, we used to have the fox hunt here, and it would come through, and I'd pretty much recognize everybody in the field. And then in its later days, more or less before they finally folded, I'd look and I'd recognize maybe 2 or 3 people, and the rest of them, you know, who are these people? And there'd be, you know, some banker from Bryn Mawr was out here, and often they didn't really quite understand country ways and would ride across freshly plowed fields and stuff, and it just, no, that's not what we do. And I know now there's some interest in having Radnor Hunt come out here and hunt, and it's at least somewhat contentious. As long as the fellow that farms this says no, I'm going to back him, because he works like the dickens for not very much money. And
what is his name?
His name's Sonny Hicks, and to vastly understate it, Sonny is a real character. I mean, he may be the most colorful person I've ever seen around here. Among other things, one time on the back of the Copes Ridge property, there was a cultivated field, and in the spring, some kid went out there and got bogged down in it in his car because he was driving through the mud. And I was talking to Sonny about that, and he says, you know, this is easy to fix. It only takes a cup. I said, well, what do you mean it only takes a cup? He says, it's just a cup. I said, what do you mean? He said, get a cup. He says, you fill it with gasoline, you go out, you open the door, you throw it in, you throw in a match and shut the door. They'll never come back. I thought, geez. Okay, yeah, I guess that'll work. But seeing Sonny, he is the size of most door frames, and I don't think anybody would want to pick a fight with him. But and now he's got 2 sons that are basically the same size that help him out. But he does a good job farming. But he's a character. He's pretty colorful. It turns out that the first year Ann and I were married, I was in the final year of grad school. She was supporting me in the style to which I'd become accustomed teaching. And we lived in Lincoln, Massachusetts. And Lincoln was way ahead of everybody else in preserving open space. And this really made an impression on us. Golly, you know, there is some way to stop, you know, this overwhelming development. And it was always in the back of our minds. And when we bought the place,
in what year?
We bought this place in 1969. And we had heard a little bit more about open space preservation, and then did hear about how conservation easements works. And I think we were like number 3 for the Brandywine Conservative. I mean, it was very early. And as I said earlier, we'd done sequential easements. We'd buy a piece, put an easement on it, use that charitable deduction as a down payment for the next piece. And yeah, it means we can't develop it. Oh, darn. You know, that's not the goal. And really through that time in Lincoln, there's a fellow up there named Lemire who really orchestrated their open space preservation, who when the King Ranch thing came up over around Unionville, I was involved in the Brandywine Conservancy at that point and said, we got to get this guy down here. And he came and basically sketched out, this is how you do this. And they did. The easements have been picked up by a number of neighbors. Some were donated easements like ours were. Some were sold easements, ag easements, I guess through the county. And then fortunately we got some very good township supervisors who said, look, we don't want this place to get atomized, because the reality is the incremental house that's built increases the demand for services more than it increases the tax base. So that if somebody builds a house, ultimately my taxes go up. I mean, I don't need anything else, but it just, that's the way it works. So they had enough good sense to, well, I guess first the county said, look, we have to do something about this, and there was a county bond issue to preserve open space, and I was quite heavily involved in that. And then the township said we should do the same thing, and it was the first municipality in Pennsylvania to do this, and it passed, you know, overwhelmingly. It was like 80% of people voting, yes, tax me, but tax me to preserve open space, and it's been extremely successful. There are still a few places left that are maybe going to be in play, don't know, but overall, between the donated easements, the ag easements, and the township easements, a good chunk of East Bradford is now tied up in open space, which I think makes it a great place to live. And actually, a lot of people come out here to enjoy Georgia Farm now, the Stroud Preserve. I can't tell you that Doc Stroud got the idea from me, although we did talk about it a fair amount while he was still around. But we've been very fortunate in frankly, what the ownership patterns have been. Again, a lot of that going back to Chick Laird, who owned sort of the center of the township for a long time. He had a lot of land here, and much of that is now under easement or under ownership of Natural Lands Trust. So we've been very fortunate, there's no question. I'm glad I was able to do some stuff in that, but I certainly can't claim that, hey, this was me and I did it. Not at all. There were a lot of people involved, and I probably was a bit player, but glad that it's been as much as it is.